Hi, guys. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Dharma Talk. I am Rabia Ilahi, a psychotherapist and energy healer down here in Houston, Texas. For any of you that are joining me for the first time, the word Dharma can mean many things. It can be our purpose or one's purpose. It can be right action or doing the right thing. So I created Dharma Talk so that I can share with you right and true information and information that I've had the privilege to learn over the years through education, access, privilege, quite honestly, and lots and lots of life experience. And I want to share as much as I can with you. And my number one intention is always to be of service to you in the highest way that I can be. And every topic, every guest that is ever on Dharma Talk is after the same thing, is to be of service and to provide good and true information. I believe that when we know better, we make better choices, and making better choices help us have better lives. So today's episode is sort of a continuation of an episode I did back in December with depression and race and how they work, how it is different, like mental wellness, mental health, issues with emotions and thinking, they show up differently in different cultures and different races. And then there are added pressures that can exacerbate things that maybe many humans go through: anxiety, depression, fear, loss, all of that. I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to convince anyone that race and culture and systemic issues are real. I am 100% in the belief that they are, and the more we are aware of our brothers and sisters who look different and are different, the more we can be as a community, because that is one thing I think COVID taught me, and hopefully taught many people, although that's not what is being seen in the world right now, is that we are a community, the entire globe. And that is why the entire globe went through the same thing. And so having said all of that, I want to introduce three absolutely amazing guests. They are healers in their communities, and they are going to help me tonight present as much good and true information as I can. My first guest, she's visiting us for the second time. Eliza Boquin is a licensed psychotherapist who works with people to overcome past traumas, emotional pain, relationship issues, and her goal is to help you enjoy pleasure-filled lives. And Eliza works with clients in her private practice. She has the Flow and Ease Center in Houston. She does workshops. She's a speaker. She has a podcast. And I wanted to make sure I get this right. Eliza has also been featured in Cosmopolitan, Men's Health, Therapy for Black Girls podcast, Exo Nicole, Bustle, Shape, and Health magazines. So amazing, amazing woman, amazing healer. The second guest, you guys, if you've seen me before, may also remember Shameitra Green is a licensed psychotherapist and founder of her own private practice called Nexus Therapy. And she works with adolescents, adults, families out in Pearland, Texas. So a little bit near Houston for those of you that aren't from here. Shameitra is, one of her focuses is working with complex trauma and PTSD. And those are specialties in and of themselves. And there's so much to say on that part. And I said to her last time, I've got to have you back on just to talk about complex trauma, because we're really experiencing a lot of it and it is sustained. And that is changing. It is changing who we are. And anyway, we'll talk more about that at another time. But Shameitra has also added chakra healing to her repertoire, to her expertise. And she has a podcast, From My Couch to Your Couch, that deals with all kinds of mental and emotional wellness, including physical wellness. Now, my third guest, brand new to Dharma Talk, and my pleasure. First time I'm working with him, Dr. Earl Turner, and it's Erlanger, but I know Dr. Earl, you go by Dr. Earl Turner. He's a licensed psychologist and professor and owner of the Turner Psychological and Consulting Services. Dr. Turner is actually nationally recognized speaker, consultant, and mental health expert. He's been quoted by top media sources, including New York Times, The Washington Post, Ebony, NPR, Oprah Magazine, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal. Can I go on? And he's also the author of Mental Health Among African Americans, Innovations in Research and Practice. And he's the former president of the Society of Child and Family Policy and Practice. So I would like to welcome all three of my guests, Eliza, Shameitra, and Dr. Earl.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Did I leave anything out? You guys have to, because there's so much, each of you is so accomplished, and I want to make sure I don't leave anything out, but
you got it.
Yeah, everything's great.
I also want to get to the heart of it. And what I wanted to focus on a lot, I know there's an echo. I don't know if anyone is getting an echo from me, or that's just me. Okay. No, it's okay. What I wanted to really talk about is how race affects mental health. Not that race causes mental health, but how it affects mental health. So I'm just wondering, in each of your experiences, what have you seen that maybe isn't commonly known or isn't part of normal everyday conversation that the dominant culture may have, including media? So I don't know, Dr. Earl, you're new. I'd love to hear from you.
Throw it out to me first, right, with the hard
Yeah,
question.
I know, right?
First, thank you again for having me here. I'm excited to share this space with all of you. I think, for me, in terms of my experiences with research in this topic and understanding just the impact that people from different communities, especially minoritized communities, experience the world differently due to oppression and racism. And
Yeah.
so I think because of those factors that we just see a lot of research really over decades providing evidence that they're at about 90% of people each day experience some level of racism and discrimination. And so just imagine that for a person of color compared to a white person that does not have to experience those things, that it can be emotionally draining on that individual. And so I think that's a huge factor. That is something that's different, that sort of the majority white American culture does not have to experience, which can make it much more stressful. And that's just one example. I mean, I'll leave it open for others to add to that, but definitely I think that's a huge factor in terms of the stresses that we may experience.
Yes.
Yeah. Just kind of to add what Dr. Earl was saying is there's unique stressors and unique factors that even people within the Black and Brown community are going to deal with that other people of color may not face, and certainly that white folks are not going to face. And so it's that prolonged stress, that chronic stress that we're under that has these long-term effects, not only on our mental health, but on our physical health as well, where one's physical safety, right? Like I'm sure Dr. Earl could tell you all the times where he might just be trying to get to work and is worried about getting to work. And just because of what he looks like and when he's coming out into the world, the threat that is there. And I think 2020 especially just highlighted on a whole other level. It's not like it was new, but it's like this whole other level of stress of seeing these types of incidents happen where Black men are being hunted down, right? And so it's like, how does that impact one's level? Then, immigration is such a big topic. And we're seeing a lot of that conversation coming up now, where we're seeing how, thankfully, wonderfully, these Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed open-armed by so many parts of the world. Well, there have been plenty of other Black and Brown countries and refugees, right, that they don't get welcomed in the same way. So how can it not impact our mental health?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well said.
And I think for me, really being able to acknowledge that our race, our ethnicity, I mean, it's part of our identity. And I think with people of color, with, Black and Brown people, often having to live kind of in this dichotomy of my skin color is perceived as a threat. My emotions are perceived as a threat. So often having clients come in and really having to almost feel like they have to choose between their presentation and how it is perceived by others and just being a human. I've had Black women come into my office and say, I don't have the language right now to tell you what it is that I want to get out of therapy. But what I do want is to be able to just be. Like, I want to scream, I want to curse, I want to do whatever and not have to deal with the discomfort that it brings up in someone else because of this label of being an angry Black woman, when it's no, you are expressing pain, you're expressing emotion, you're being a human. So often having to deal with the chronic trauma of, my identity, my race, and, and what does that mean to my humanity, and how oftentimes that is the very thing that makes people forget about my humanity.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because I think that is what has become painfully obvious, hopefully painfully obvious, that the perceived differences and the perceived threats, that one's perception of another person, we are able to feel the perception. We are by large nonverbal communicators, and we sense when we are being perceived a certain way. And I can pass for a lot of things. So I don't have to deal with it the way a Black person would have to deal with it. I just don't, and there's only so much I can understand. I can understand as a Muslim from, a misogynistic culture, because I can't hide that I'm a woman, but I can get away with a lot more and not have to deal with the constant energetic projection of fear. What have you, has there been a difference in males and females of color in your practices?
Difference how? What do you mean? Like difference in
presentation, in the issues that they may come in with, why they would come to therapy in the first place? It's not allowed in a lot of cultures.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I think is promising is, I would say within maybe the last 4 to 5 years, I think as mental health has been more of a conversation within our communities, whether that be because there's more celebrities coming through, there's more musicians coming through that are being transparent about their own mental health challenges, about encouraging therapy, that I'm seeing more Black and brown folks in therapy. So I will say with my practices primarily consists of Black and brown folks, right? Like probably like 95% of that. So what I would say that I see different is on some level, people are trying therapy for the first time. So I think that's what's consistent within like people from our community is like, well, okay, it's always been something that we were told not to do or that it wasn't for us. That's not what we do. We go to church, we talk to the priest, the pastor, we prayed away, or, we keep those types of conversations within the house. We don't put our business out there. And I think now there is a more openness. And I still think that though for women, because the majority of us are socialized to be in touch with our emotions, to express our emotions, there's a difference between that and then the men that are coming to therapy where it's like, even just learning that, what do you mean? What am I feeling? So I think the openness is consistent. And yet like what they might be showing up for and how they approach it. Because one of the things that I really appreciate though also with men is they're very goal oriented. Right? So here is my issue, like let's get to it, right? So and they'll be a lot of times be very motivated, but then it's again like what is it that you're working on? It may be more of like how to increase my emotional intelligence, right? Whereas the women that aren't socialized to know who they are and be assertive and ask for they want, that may be more of what they're working on.
And just to sort of add to that, I think part of the challenge sometimes is that it's not that men are not emotionally intelligent. I mean, obviously, depending on someone's background and their socialization, that could be really different. But I think another huge barrier is that because of the way that the majority of men are socialized, and I'll put myself out there too, because I think even as a psychologist, sometimes I have to overcome that challenge about, talking about my own feelings as well. So from that perspective, like I get it. But I think the other piece is that because a lot of men have had these like rigid expectations of themselves from society, from their communities, from their wives, from their girlfriends, that they also then don't necessarily feel comfortable expressing those emotions, even though they can and that they do in certain spaces, that in the therapy room, that's a lot different than if I was talking to my friend or my buddy about my feelings of what's made me angry or why I'm disappointed or sad about this relationship.
Yeah.
And so I think that also it can cause some challenges with that in terms of that openness in therapy. And so I think when there is, if we talk about this relationship in therapy, if the therapist is male and it's also a male client, I think those dynamics can be different, not always, but I think that there may be this vulnerability that is allowed, that he allows himself to feel when he's working with a male therapist, as opposed to him maybe warming up potentially, to a female therapist.
Yeah, I can see that. Because there are gender, it is not just culture and race. And I know there's a comment about replacing possibly the word race with something more accurate. So we can talk about that too. But there is, gender is also, and I'm talking cisgender, right? I'm not even getting into they and them and fluid, non-binary. And that adds another level of complexity. One of the things I hear a lot is, I think, Eliza, to your point, well, pray it away. Why do you need to talk to somebody on the outside? Go to the pastor or the preacher, or only crazy people get therapy. And I don't want to have to pop some pills that I'm going to be dependent on the rest of my life to function, to be happy. What is y'all's experience with that? Or what would you say to someone that's like, therapy is only for crazy people? Dr. Earl.
It's like I was trying to hold myself back.
I know. I saw you.
I just jump in because I think that's something that I've heard a lot, from some of my clients that I've worked with in the past, and it's something that I talk a lot about, particularly in social media spaces or if I'm doing interviews. I think we need to really think about the language that we use when we talk about therapy, because I think historically the way that, without sort of going through the textbook, for people that have been in the field, like we are aware about where this field started from, in terms of at least sort of American, psychology counseling. But I think we do have to really change the language and normalize the benefits of therapy, and that you don't have to have a label or diagnosis to seek help or talk to someone. And I think one of the really important conversations that we've been having more is about how do we talk about therapy as more sort of a wellness perspective. So we have wellness checks for our physical health. Why can't we have wellness checks for our mental health? And so that I think if we can begin to use that language and talk about therapy in that way, in terms of how it can be helpful to give people some tools and skills to navigate different situations, then we may be able to remove some of the stigma that has remained over decades when it comes to, this idea about it's for crazy people.
Yeah.
And kind of adding to what Dr. Earl is saying, so my philosophy when people come to see me is to share that the therapeutic space is really a space where my humanity meets your humanity. And because I often share, oftentimes we look for healing, we're kind of looking through the front door and it hits us from the back door. So whatever you're coming in here for, that is the catalyst that brought you into this space. But once you get here, that's kind of why you're sitting here and you realize, I've been telling this lady all this other stuff that's coming up, and it wasn't initially what I thought that I was coming in here for. So, I share with them, part of what makes this a beautiful transaction is we may not have experienced the exact same things in our lives, but it's about what these experiences have brought up for us. So if it's brought up sadness, if it's brought up betrayal, if it's brought up abandonment. And so we can all, for the most part, think of moments in our lives where those emotions, those experiences have been evoked. And that's where the empathy and the shared humanity space comes in. So in that languaging, it really just kind of helps people to just normalize that it is hard being a human, just period. And so it does not have to come from some medical DSM book. It doesn't, you can come in and really just deal with your heart woes. That is what this space is for. And so being able to kind of bridge it from that, from some of the less clinical terms, and really make it about using human terms is what softens people, and it makes people feel like, okay, there's a place for me. And the other thing, especially when working with minority communities and just kind of, church, religion, that has been our resourcing for the longest time, for our survival, and so much that we've been through. And so I never, never knock it. I'm a Christian woman myself, but what I evolved that conversation is into the relationship that you have with the word strength, the relationship that you have with the word resilience. And what does that look like? What does that look like as a Black man? What does that look like as a Black woman? What does that look like as a brown woman? And because I am a family therapist and everything is relational to me, I often like to allow for people to kind of really sit in that space of, how is this a part of my identity, And so then that goes to a further conversation about, okay, so in your family, strength was seen as bear down, take it, pray about it. And so it just helps them to be able to trace it outside of more than, oh, it was more than just about praying. It was about how my family saw strength, how my family saw resilience, and then being able to say, this is what worked for me then. And I thank those things, because I wouldn't be where I'm at without that resourcing. But now, in where I want to move forward, there has been some limitations and some challenges, and I'm kind of stifled. And so now, if it no longer works, it's okay for me to put it down, tell it, thank you for getting me thus far. But now I need to pick up other tools and resources to take me along to the next stage of where I'm trying to get to. So that's part of my languaging with my clients.
That's beautiful. Go ahead, Eliza.
Yeah, what I think, kind of echoing a lot of what Shameitra said, one of the things that I often tell people is that we don't have to be in crisis to go to therapy, right? Like, so when we think about our mental health and what affects it, it's like Dr. Earl said, it doesn't have to be this major diagnoses. Stress impacts our mental health. We all have stress. If you are alive at this time in the world, there is stress, right? So that is a space where you can go to process some of that. I think the other thing that I encourage people to do is to question where these messages came from, right? So historically, for our communities, it is not safe for us to be vulnerable. We're already vulnerable in the world. And so a lot of these messages that we got from our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents was to keep us safe, right? Like, so not show more of the vulnerability that you were going to be taken advantage for having. The other part is like what Dr. Earl said, this therapy as we know it was not designed for us. It was not created to be a safe space for us. So much of what I and my colleagues here are doing is changing the face of therapy, right? We are trying to let our communities know, actually, healing has always been part of who we are. Before it was the elder in the tribe, it is the pastor that you might go see. It's that wise woman that was helping to heal all of the, children that you would bring to her. We have always sought out counsel. And the fourth thing that I would say is, who does it benefit for you to ignore your mental health?
Yeah.
Somebody's benefiting from you not caring for yourself. Somebody is benefiting from you producing, suck it up, keep going. But it's not us.
Nope.
And Black and brown bodies, historically, present day, the value that's been placed on them is for production and consumption of others. Yeah. So we have to start questioning where some of these messages really originated from.
I want to add just briefly, because what you said about this vulnerability piece, I think is really important, especially for men. because I think that it's not allowed to be vulnerable in a lot of spaces. And I've had, conversations with couples where it's the male he's been conditioned throughout his life to be the provider and take care of the family. And so you're not allowed to be emotionally, I won't say weak, I hate to use that word, but you're not allowed to have emotional difficulties and say that you can't handle the stress that you may be under in those situations. So I think if you're in therapy, like, it can take a lot out of you to like show that vulnerable side, because it can be looked at by others as a weakness, especially if we look at like the dominant society and how men are sort of, what is this view that we're oftentimes viewed as. And so I think it takes a lot to like overcome that, to then allow yourself that space to be vulnerable and get that sort of emotional release that you also need as a human being.
So I completely agree. And safety, and is so critical. And also the languaging, like we've been talking about the languaging of vulnerability, that showing emotions isn't a weakness. It's actually access to more of us, right? Like, oh, this is, and it takes a while to practice identifying, feeling, number one, because it hasn't been safe. And then identifying what that feeling may be, and then what can I do? One of the other comments, which I'm sure you guys have heard, is that, nothing's going to change. It is what it is. It's not like anything will be different. I'll just know that I'm suffering.
Well, and one thing that I think we also have to make part of that conversation when we're asking people to be vulnerable. And again, if we tie this back into race, is that, again, you are asking people who are already vulnerable in this world, who this world is not safe for, to be more vulnerable. So that's counterintuitive. The other thing, I think we're talking about how difficult it is for men to be vulnerable. And again, add to that race, a Black man, a brown man, I think the other side of the coin to that is, as women, we are also socialized not to see that in men. Yeah. So as much as we say, well, we want to see men be more emotional and open and vulnerable, can we handle it? Yeah, they start expressing their emotions and be vulnerable, because it's not what we're used to. And I think that is something that they're not the only ones that are impacted by that. We are too, in what feels unfamiliar to us when men start to do more of this. Just like you see like this shift. I mean, it's International Women's Day, but what has happened as women have stepped more into their power and owned more of who they are? It's been very unsettling to many, because this is not the role that you were assigned for your gender. Yes. Well, we're going to have to experience that on a level also when we're telling men, embrace this part of you. Can we truly embrace it?
Yes, I've had couples where when in heterosexual couples, when the man is saying like, oh, he's in his emotions, and she's looking at him like, wait, I don't want you to cry. What am I supposed to do when you're crying? Because I'm the one that cries. Being relationship oriented, we don't know what to do as women. I think that must be so scary for men, that they're allowing something in themselves, and then there's a judgment by the person that they're possibly closest to. That's tough.
And I also want to add a component to this conversation, because I think in doing couples work, and especially when you have heterosexual couple, a Black woman and a Black man talking about vulnerability. So there's a part of him that is not used for this world, creating a space for him to feel safe in vulnerability. But there's also a part of the world that for Black women that also does not create that space for vulnerability as well. And from Black women experience, it's kind of like when everything was going on in the racial awakening, we would hear about George Floyd. We would hear about the Black men, Trayvon. We had to speak a little bit louder to hear about Sandra Bland. We had to speak a little bit louder to hear about Breonna Taylor. Yes. And so part of that is I think Black women coming into a space where it's like, and this is historical, and we can go back to when Black men were being ripped from their families and being sold, and it all kind of goes back to that. But this whole thing of, I kind of have to bear the brunt of everything, because I also know the plight of my father. I know the plight of my husband. I know the plight of my brother. And so, but while they're dealing with this, how it is as a Black male, I'm also dealing with the Blackness of my skin and the patriarchy and what that looks like. And sometimes when you have a couple, it breaks my heart sometimes to see that they're both needing for the other to see their vulnerability, because Black men are also used to having these strong Black moms that have just made a way. We don't know how she did it, but she just made a way. And so they're looking for this softness that sometimes get lost, in the family dynamic and all of that. And then a Black woman is looking to also just be able to be soft and let me just kind of melt and let me just kind of be carried away. So they're both, men and women are both looking for a place where their vulnerability can be safe. And oftentimes, in Black relationships, it's sometimes have to look at me going out in the world and dealing with the perceived threat of me, you going out in the world and dealing with the perceived threat of me, and now how do we hold that space for each other as a couple? And that can get lost. So them being students of one another.
Yeah. Dr. Earl, you look like you want to jump in.
No, I agree with all of that. And I was also looking at some of the comments as well. So I think as Shameitra was talking, one of the things that I was really thinking about is how far back can we go in terms of like what messages are we receiving about that? Because I think one, obviously, like at the societal level, like we see things played out in TV and movies, et cetera, about relationships and like who's supposed to be the strong one, or how much a Black woman or a woman of color is sort of dealing with and taking on in terms of, the whole family unit that she's like keeping together. And then we have these things that we see in our own families about that. And I sort of mention this, often to people, little self-disclosure, that even though I am a therapist, I'm in a profession where I've learned and been conditioning myself to be more okay with talking about feelings, that it also is hard sometimes when I'm in my own family and the space that's given to me to do that is not always there. It's like, okay, I have conversations with family members and it's a short conversation. We check in and like it's gone, but that's the way that we've been conditioned as a family. Like men aren't supposed to have long conversations and talk about a lot of things. And so I think it takes a lot to get through that. And sort of the comment that was in the chat box is that I don't know what that time limit is to, like, how do we rework our understanding about what space that we need as humans to be vulnerable and to give each other that. I think it's going to take a lot of time, because we're rewiring a lot, historically, not just within our own families.
And what I love is knowing history, knowing who is benefiting, like you said, Eliza. What do I get out of denying myself peace, because being vulnerable isn't just expressing, it's also feeling more. So it may be expressing more love, but it's also allowing one to be loved, and that can be very difficult when there's not trust in what love looks like. and what love is supposed to feel like. And there was another thought I had on the point about where is this thought coming from, or where does this belief come from? Is it my belief? Is it my family's belief? Is it my neighborhood or my socioeconomic level? You know, is it a belief in the part of the US or another country that I grew up in? So what is mine? And I think that's challenging. And maybe one of the beauties of therapy is to get to know yourself. Like, what do you really think and feel?
Yeah. I think to add to that, as we're talking about how race impacts our mental health, well, when we think about unprocessed trauma that gets passed down in the DNA, right? Which there's plenty of research to show, epigenetics, like this happens. So I don't just inherit, my grandmother's facial features and my hair color from my ancestors. I've inherited any unprocessed trauma that they passed down. So you don't have to go very far back. I mean, again, present day trauma, but think about for Black folks, especially Black folks in the US. You think about for example, my family was a family of migrant workers, right? And so the experiences that they had, the fear with like immigration, being deported, all of those fears that they then passed down in our DNA. So we're not only, on one hand, we have a privilege that our ancestors didn't have. And now that we have the luxury of, in many ways, being able to heal when they were just primarily in survival mode, like hand to mouth type of poverty or situations that they may have been dealing with, right? So we have a certain luxury that they didn't have to be able to like, well, what am I feeling as a result of this? That, I'm thinking about my grandmother trying to just pick tomatoes to make do. You know what I mean? Like, so I think we're not just dealing with our present day trauma. We're trying to heal the trauma from our ancestors. And so that's no easy feat. You combine that with, again, especially for women, for Black and brown women, we're celebrated for not healing. Yeah. Right? Like I can't and for not asking for help. I've been to way too many funerals where the woman is, they're talking about her. She died from some sort of chronic illness or what have you. And she was such a good woman. She never complained. She was dying from this chronic illness and nobody knew how much pain she was in.
Yeah.
We're celebrated for you're celebrated for not, for not complaining, So those, I think, are those bigger questions that we have to ask. Why?
Yeah.
And who benefits? Because it's not us.
Correct.
The other thing too, I want, as you were saying that, Eliza, it made me think about, I think another reason why people endure so much and have difficulties with going to therapy and getting healing spaces is because of the way that our ancestors have dealt with this trauma. And so I can think, again, like for my own self, that in terms of Black Lives Matter and everything that happened in 2020, sometimes I would think back to say, our ancestors have dealt with a lot of things in civil rights and stuff. Like if they can go through all of this, then I can sort of deal with some of the things that are going on. So I think for a lot of people, it's that, we've dealt with so much, we're going to be okay. We don't have to go to therapy and sit down and talk about it and process all of these things. But in reality, we do, because if you do hold all of those things in, it's not healthy for you, and it can lead you to more emotional difficulties and obviously, some physical challenges as well. And so I think that's a huge barrier that, we have up against us, even though things are changing, we still now have to overcome this mindset that we've learned all of our lives historically about sort of how do we cope when life is tough.
Yeah. And I would say to that also, we now the thought evaporated. Oh, but what I was going to say is, like, so those messages were well intended, but they were in survival mode.
Yes.
Those are survival mode messages. We don't want to just survive. Like, we are ready to thrive. You know what I mean? And so, which is also, again, it's very difficult to thrive when you're in the middle of a pandemic and the world is on fire, you know? So it's all of those things that we want to take into consideration when we're thinking about wellness, just overall wellness. And you know, I wanted to kind of like go back to the part of the unprocessed trauma. If you haven't already checked out the book, My Grandmother's Hands, by Resma, I don't want to mispronounce his last name, Menakem, but he talks about not just like the unprocessed trauma that Black and brown folks have, but that white folks have.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so what was it like for white folks' ancestors when they were viewing lynchings?
Mm-hmm.
What is the stuff that got passed down in their DNA?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that impact them today? So we can't get away from race and mental health, no matter what race, because that, you know, somebody mentioned that that's a construct also. But you know, it all impacts overall our health because there's so many layers to us.
And that part is education. To me, it's getting awareness in everyday language that our genetics do carry changes based on trauma that our ancestors faced. And if we don't heal, some of that is passed down to our kids and grandkids and on and on. It's not like a moral failing. It is a physiological effect, you know, and just like stress and depression and fear, living in fight or flight, what that does to your system and how it keeps us from accessing the thriving part of our brains because it's all back here, you know. So it's deep. It's deep. I like this conversation because I think it's critical that we make it normal to know that our emotions are just as real as toothaches and broken bones. And the pain of growth is, maybe therapists can be like spotters in the gym. You know, this is heavy. I gotta lift. Can I get a little bit of help? You know, or show me a better technique, which we don't seem to have an ego about that. But with therapy, it's different.
And I think also how powerful of a notion is that you're, by you tending to yourself, and we kind of started this conversation with being part of a larger community, being part, like the pandemic showed us we are connected on a global level, but how powerful that my own healing helps to shift the DNA of my lineage, present day, future, and past, because our relationships to our ancestors and our, you know, how the relationship, because we still have relationships with them, right? Like that shifts the relationships we have with them, you know, and I'll give you like an example, like my father passed away last year. But even as I'm doing my own healing and I'm better understanding maybe some of the trauma he had, my relationship, even though my father is not here physically, it's still shifting. You know what I mean? So it's so powerful. And I think it's even on some level our divine responsibility that if we can do this healing, that we do it.
One of the things that I try to mention a lot is access to information and access to getting help. And I'm wondering what ideas or what could be available to someone who thinks, well, it's too expensive. A lot of the therapists don't take insurance anymore. And what am I going to do? You know? So this thing about access. Anyone?
I don't want to keep jumping in here, so I'm trying to let other people.
Well, you know, you got a lot to say, Eliza. That's good.
Well, okay. So I think yes. And then accessing Black and brown therapists is even harder because there's just not as many of us out. That just is. But there are options. So if you do have insurance, check to see who's in network. You have your EAP, those programs, employer assisted programs that will often give you a certain amount. You have, if you're in a town where there is a university, right? Like a lot of college students, the universities will have a clinic on campus where you can go for a reduced fee. There are many therapists that are even in private practice who will allow for a sliding scale. You've got agencies who also see sliding scale. So many of us offered video sessions prior to the pandemic, but just about everybody was offering after the pandemic. So what that means is whoever is in your state. So you don't even have to have somebody in your city. Like, see who's in your state that might be able to afford, that you might be able to afford that. There are options. I'm not going to discredit that it's difficult. The system is broken. That's why so many clinicians don't take insurance. But there are options. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But if you really want to go to therapy, don't give up. It may take some time for you to make that connection, but there are options.
Yeah. Well said. There was a comment here that most people who need therapy do not have the means to commit to a program long enough to get the help that they need. And what you're saying, Eliza, is that, yeah, it does suck, and it is difficult. And so, but maybe not to quit trying. And there are more online options, I think, now than there used to be.
I just want to add quickly. I think the other thing to think about in terms of resources is to look for organizations that do provide pro bono services. So the only thing that pops to my head right now is Taraji B. Henson's, the Boris Henson Foundation is one organization that across different states, they do provide some free services. So look into some of those. I think there's another organization, I'm probably going to misquote this, but I think Black Men Heal or something also offers some free services. You can find them on Instagram and look them up. So there are places. It is difficult to find.
It is.
And I also think that the healing process is on a continuum, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, even resources like podcasts that are out there, people come to therapy and a lot of insight and awareness is delivered there, but the work happens in the ongoing application of your life. That's really where the healing starts to happen. So even if you're in a space where it's like, let me look up mental health podcasts, because they're having conversations around whatever, you may be challenged with, where people are giving out resources or they're giving out tips. And so you're starting to take in information that you need. Typically, you're also being provided with maybe workbooks or resources, but all of those things, typically when you're in therapy, are complementary to what we do in therapy anyway. So even if that's a place where you have to start, that within itself is you being the agent of change that you need for yourself and for your family. So I would even explore, those resources as well.
One more thing that I often forget is group therapy.
Yeah.
A lot of agencies, hospitals, even therapists in private practice will offer group therapy. So it could be a fraction of the cost of what you might pay for individual. And group therapy is very powerful also because we don't heal in isolation, right? So being part of a group, often you'll get a different dynamic than you might in individual therapy, and we heal in community.
Absolutely. I self-disclosure, I did group therapy for quite a while before, I went back to school to learn what I'm doing now. And it was invaluable because my relationship stuff showed up with the other people in group therapy. And so it was like live in the moment type of awareness and support and practicing vulnerability in front of other people. And also, there's so much going on in our minds, but talking about it and getting feedback, maybe not advice in group therapy, but just feedback, or like, oh yeah, I did that too, which is priceless, to know that you're not alone in your experiences.
Yeah. And kind of just echoing what Shameitra said, that there are many paths to healing. So therapy is great. We're all advocates here, but it's not the only way to heal. And so I love what Shameitra said, like, start where you're at with what resources are available. And these days, there's so many resources out there.
I feel you wanting to jump in, Dr. Earl.
No, I was just agreeing. I'm the choir back here.
Oh, yeah.
So, I think definitely, podcasts are great resources. Self-help books can also be helpful for people that are self-motivated to do that.
Yeah.
But you do have to know yourself, because I think for some people, like, podcasts, books, support groups are not what they feel is helpful for them. So I think understanding that is also one important part of the healing process, is like knowing what you need, because if it is that one-on-one relationship, then you probably are not going to feel as supported in a group therapy setting. So you do need to sort of understand those important aspects as well.
I will say that I did my internship at a nonprofit, and we did really, really good work. Even though we were interns, we were very closely supervised. And you could come in for $25, a session, which maybe you could go twice a month or a little more. And so because we were interns, we weren't working just as students. We were very carefully guided and watched over. And I think the clients got a lot out of that. So there are nonprofits that are worth it if we want healing. We're close to time, so I want to ask each of you that if there's one piece of advice you could give to anyone watching who is Black or brown, what would that be?
I'll jump in. So one piece of advice that I often give people is really, like, don't be afraid to question a potential therapist. So if you are seeking help for someone, and they can also be from your own community, that it's okay to ask questions about their experience and what you need. And if that person can't provide that, it's okay to look for someone else. That may be that you have to temporarily work with that person before you sort of, find a better fit. But don't be afraid to at least give it a try and say, this person was great for the time being, but they're not the best person to help meet my needs.
Yeah, that's great.
I would say to challenge yourself to redefine strength for yourself, right? Especially from our communities where strength is measured by how much pain we can tolerate, to include asking for support, advocating for your needs, advocating for your wellness is part of your definition of strength.
Yeah. Beautiful.
I often remind people that your longest relationship you will ever be in is the one with yourself. That is a relationship that you cannot escape. And so because of that, that is the primary relationship for you to work on. And everything after that will expand and it will be better for it based off of how you show up for you. So I always end it with you are worth showing up for you over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you guys so much for coming and joining this conversation. And the one thing that I would want to, my little tidbit to anyone watching, is that none of us does this by ourselves. We do heal in community, and we are part of community even when we're told that we don't belong. And I want people to know what a miracle it is that you're here as a physical being. And life is hard, we don't have to do it by ourselves. So thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Honestly, I'm honored and humbled by your experience. And for all of you guys watching, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'll see you next time.